Welcome, everybody. I am going to go ahead and get started. My name is Eselyn Gambert, and I'm the Interim Director of the Fundamentals of Lawyering program at the George Washington University Law School. I also teach a seminar called Gender, Race, and Species, and I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you today. This discussion is called Fostering Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Animal Law Education and Beyond, a law student and recent graduate panel on race. We hope to have a discussion today that is at once broad and deep, and that explores a wide range of issues and topics that are relevant to law students, law faculty, and legal practitioners, especially in the animal law space, but beyond it as well. We hope to explore and reflect critically on the ways in which race, as well as white supremacy and racism have impacted and continue to impact our lives, both inside and outside the law school classroom, as well as what we can do about it, both individually and collectively. Before we begin, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge those that have been historically and systematically marginalized and oppressed by settler colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. Indigenous land acknowledgements are commonplace in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but they're relatively rare here in the United States outside of Indigenous and sort of social justice spaces. I realize that they can be fraught and can be seen sometimes as performative, but I do think it's important to recognize the first people who were oppressed by white supremacy on this continent, and to recognize also that colonization is an ongoing process, that Indigenous people are still here, and that their lands are still being occupied. I'm speaking today from so-called Washington, D.C., the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people and the traditional territory of Piscataway Nation. This land was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. And today this land, as well as my law school, is named after George Washington, who was not just complicit in, but an active agent of the violent removal of Indigenous people from the physical and cultural landscape, as well as a slave owner. So I just ask you to please take a moment now to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across barriers of heritage and difference, and for combating the systems and interests that keep us from building a truly just world. I also just want to acknowledge that some of you might be wondering what a white cisgender woman might be doing co-moderating this panel on race. First, I just want to say I'm humbled to be here, and I'm mindful that my role is to center the voices of our panelists and to give them the space to reflect and engage with all of you. I also want to say that I think it's critical that white people like myself be part of conversations like this, because white supremacy isn't going to go away unless white people become active and intentional in resisting and trying to dismantle it. And the last thing I'll say is that through my own scholarship and teaching and activism, which explores the intersection of racism, sexism, and speciesism, I strive to reflect deeply on these issues as a scholar and as a teacher and as a human, and as someone that's responsible for trying my best to create a space where all of my students feel seen and heard and able to learn. So before we dive in, I just want to say a brief word about the format of today's event. I'm joined today by my co-moderator, Raj Reddy, and our three esteemed panelists. I'll be turning the mic over to Raj in just a moment. We'll be introducing our panelists, and we'll then ask them a series of questions for the first part of the event. Then we'll be switching gears and we'll be taking questions from you, the audience. If at any time, even before the formal audience Q&A portion begins, you have a question for someone, please feel free to place that question in the chat. If it makes sense and is organic to our conversation, Raj or I or one of our speakers might incorporate your question or respond to it during the course of the first portion of our event. The event will run roughly 90 minutes, and we expect that the last 30 minutes or so will be dedicated to you, the audience, being able to connect directly with our panelists and ask them questions. Okay, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome and introduce my co-moderator, Raj Reddy, who is the director of the Animal Law Program at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School.
Thanks so much, Iselin. I just want to start by saying the land on which Lewis and Clark stands, what's today called Multnomah County, was home to many tribal people. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge them, the Multnomah, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watalala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River, whose land was, as Iselin observed, stolen from them in an attempt to remove them as well. And I think this recognition is salient for our gathering today for the namesakes of both of our institutions, as Iselin again observed, George Washington and Lewis and Clark were not just complicit in, but actually active agents of their violent removal from the physical and cultural landscape, as well as slave owners. And I think we call attention to these harms to touch upon the implications of what it means to be affiliated with institutions that bear these names, and also as a backdrop to reflect upon this present moment where institutions of higher education in many states are actively erasing the experiences of BIPOC and other marginalized groups, whether through book bans, course removals, or otherwise. And while this epistemological violence is felt across numerous disciplines, our panelists today will be calling attention to the experiences of BIPOC students and alumni engaged in or else looking to integrate animal advocacy into their broader social justice efforts, with the larger hope that we can take what we learn here to foster a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive environment for our own animal law classrooms, organizations, events, and otherwise. With that said, Iselin and I would now like to introduce our esteemed panelists.
All right, I would like to introduce Kailey McNeal. Kailey is a native of Dallas, Texas, who found her passion for animal protection as the child and grandchild of animal lovers. She began volunteering at a local animal shelter at 12 years old and became vegan when she was 15. She received her bachelor's degree in political studies from Pitzer College in Claremont, California, where she led a Green Monday initiative to improve the sustainability of campus dining halls and co-led Claremont Students for Animals. Her studies at Pitzer focused on a personal journey of integrating her Black identity and love for animals, culminating in the completion of her senior thesis, advocating for an alliance between the prison abolition, feminist, animal protection, and racial justice movements. Currently, Kailey is a rising 2L at the George Washington University Law School, where she is a member of the Black Law Students Association, the GW Law Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter, a participant in the Animal Welfare Pro Bono Project, and a volunteer for the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project. Kailey, we're really thrilled to have you here.
And next we have Karli Uwaine, who is a rising 3L at Lewis and Clark, where she is the co-director of the Animal Legal Defense Fund student chapter and on track to receive certificates in both animal and environmental law. Her studies have thus far focused on how to blur the line that divides humans from animals, the protection of wildlife and endangered species, and how to elevate the status of animals in the law. She believes that a compassion and empathy for all, including non-human animals, is what the future of our planet depends on. Thanks so much for being here, Karli.
And our third and final panelist is AJ Link. AJ Link was a student in my gender, race, and species class when he was a law student at the George Washington University Law School. AJ Link is openly autistic. He received, as I just explained, his JD from GW Law and his LLM in space law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. He's the inaugural director of the Center for Air and Space Law Task Force on Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity in Aerospace, and is an adjunct professor of space law at Howard University School of Law in Washington, D.C. AJ is the communications director for Mission Astro Access and works as a research director for the JUICE Ad Astra project. And I apologize if I mispronounced that. I think I probably did. He serves as the Space Law and Policy Chair for Black and Astro and was the founding president of the National Disabled Law Students Association. Welcome, AJ. It's so great to see you again. So, oh, I'm sorry. I missed a couple of lines from AJ's bio. AJ is a policy analyst for the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. He's been actively involved with disability advocacy in Washington, D.C. and nationally. He serves on several advisory boards and steering committees that focus on disability advocacy and broader social justice movements. So Really delighted to have these three panelists here, current law students and relatively recent alum who have such a sort of broad range of experience in different social justice movements and experience with animal law and the animal justice movement as well. So I want to start off with a big, broad question that I'd love for all of you to respond to. So you've all engaged with the intersection of animal law and broader social issues in your law school courses and or law student organizations you've been involved in. And we're really looking forward to delving into your experiences in the law school context in particular today. But before we do that, I'm wondering if you could each speak to if and how you've had to negotiate issues of race and belonging in the animal advocacy movement and or other social justice movements that you've been a part of or are currently a part of, either before the law school context or during or outside or since you've been in law school. I don't know if any of you would like to go first. Do we have anyone that would like to tackle that question first? Kailey? Oh, sorry, AJ, please go ahead.
Go ahead, Kailey, go ahead. I'm interested in your answer, so yeah.
Okay, I'll start. Yeah, so I have kind of an interesting answer to this. So I definitely came to my identity as an animal lover, as an animal person, long before I came to my racial identity. When I was 12 years old, I started volunteering at the animal shelter, as Professor Gambert said, and I just realized that animals were everything for me. Like, that was what got me up in the morning. That's what I wanted to do. And so I created my animal world persona, being Kailey, the animal lover. And it wasn't until I, was maybe 18, 19 that I started kind of going through an identity crisis, figuring out who I was, and realized, oh, wait a minute, I'm also Kailey the Black woman, and that's really important to me. And that has to be part of Kailey the animal lover. Kailey the animal lover and Kailey the Black woman are the same person. And so what I went through was not really struggling myself, trying to figure out how those two things fit together, because for me that it made sense. It's me, but having to explain to everybody else and get everybody else on board with that. So the animal groups that I had been working with, the people who I had known in the movement for so long, had to start to come to terms with Kailey the Black woman, who also really cares about racial justice and also cares about Black Lives Matter and wants that to be part of her animal activism as well. And so I've really struggled trying to figure out how to balance all of those identities. And I think for me, it kind of all came to a head in summer of 2020 when I tried to explore my Blackness with some animal groups and say, hey, like, this is something that I want to think about. I've been going to this social justice college in California, and now I see all these intersections and I want to talk about it. And they were like, and that's great, but we're here for the animals. So Blackness gets sidelined because that's a different movement. They have their advocates. We got to stay in our lane. We don't want to pander. We don't want to, we want to stay on track. And so for me, as a young person who is like, I love animals and I want to dedicate my life to this, to be told, oh, but that part of you has to stay behind. You have to do something else with that part was really difficult. And I kind of came to law school because I was like, I want to go into animal work. I don't know what I want to do, but I was just told that the animal movement doesn't have a place for me. So I thought, okay, well, I need some systemic change in the animal movement. I thought the animal movement was the systemic change, but now that needs to be changed too. So yeah, I think I'm still navigating that. I'm still trying to figure out what to do with that. And honestly, I'm at a crossroads right now trying to decide if this is, animal world is still the place for me because of all of that.
Thanks, Kailey. AJ.
Oh, I'm glad I let Kaylee go first. That answer's probably way better than mine. Hey y'all, I'm AJ. It's AJ speaking. I have on a blue Lightning hat. I'm from Tampa, and they are doing pretty well in the playoffs right now. I have on a weirdish shade of green or turquoise shirt, and it says "Thoughts and Prayers" and it's crossed out. And then I don't know if you can see the bottom, but it says "Policy and Change." And then there's a wonderful gallery wall behind me that was completely done by my partner, and the only thing I contributed was the pictures of the dogs above the mirror. It's amazing to be here. When Professor Gambert first reached out, I was like, I don't have a ton of experience in animal laws and animal movements. Professor Gambert's class was one of the first experiences I had getting deep into it. And I approach it from a different perspective. I try to incorporate animal rights, animal justice, at least the consideration of animals and other social justice movements. My main area of work is disability justice and disability rights. And I oftentimes incorporate, how we treat animals and the intersection of ableism, and how that applies to human and non-human animals alike. Like an easy example is, racehorses, after they're no longer considered able-bodied, if they're not rescued, they're oftentimes, put down. And we do this with all types of animals, not just racehorses, but like greyhounds and other things, or pets we are tired of. And I think for me, as I've read more, I've been a vegan, I've not been a vegan, I've been a vegetarian, not been a vegetarian. I think it's something that I struggle with to try to navigate is how do I do social justice properly and authentically, while acknowledging, that I'm flawed, I'm not perfect, right? And I think for me, in terms of the different areas that I go, I don't necessarily have to navigate my race. I'm oftentimes put in places where there aren't other disabled Black men who are as privileged as I am with, all the degrees and access and all those cool things that I have. And so for me, it's not so much having to navigate race, but to create space for other marginalized folks, even if they aren't Black, to say like, hey, there are more stories, there are more perspectives. And I take it as my responsibility as someone who has a little bit of weight and privilege in certain social justice circles, to create that for other people. And I wish I could give more platforms to folks who are doing animal rights work. But quite frankly, animal rights work is really, really siloed and segregated, as Kailey was talking about. But also just like incredibly white, like beyond white. And so it's really hard to find people who have had access to that information who are doing other social justice movements, right? So a lot of times, and this is I think this is an indictment, both of social justice, of me, but also the animal rights movement. I am people's first kind of touch point into discussing animal rights through ableism and kind of mass slaughter of animals at just an astonishing rate. And that's a huge problem, right? Because I'm not really an animal law and animal rights expert. I just kind of have tangential access to that community and that information. And so it really shows how we have to do a better job of connecting one another, to show how all these movements are interconnected. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Thanks so much, AJ. Karli, I'd love to invite you to share your thoughts.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This is the first time I'm ever speaking on a panel, or even speaking about race and social justice. So I'm really excited to be here and also to just learn from everyone else who is speaking today. Interestingly, I feel like I learned how to navigate, or I guess negotiate, issues of race and really only had discussions of race in law school. And the reason why I say interestingly is that I feel that the legal field is very traditional, where collectively I think that it really seems to be behind in these areas. And so even though I was heavily involved with environmental rights and the animal advocacy movement throughout college, and also growing up, I feel like the topic of race wasn't really talked about, or at least I was never really in discussions that talked about race and the animal advocacy movement. And so I wish that I was exposed to, the issues of race earlier on, as I was, really gaining interest in animal rights, rather than, getting to law school and then only recently, really having these hard discussions. And I'm just hoping that we can kind of see that shift where in college or even in high school, and you kind of are exposed to these issues of race at an earlier stage in your life or just at a younger age. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful, but I would really love to see that shift.
Thanks so much, Karli. And on sort of this topic of, being students of color in law school, I'm just wondering if you could speak to, did you find that it was a different experience being a student of color at GW or at Lewis and Clark? And so in the animal law school context, the law school context as a whole, but also in your animal law classrooms and or student groups, what has that been like for you all?
I can speak to this really briefly, but I feel fortunate that at Lewis and Clark, I personally haven't really experienced any negative situations regarding being a student of color in law school. But however, that isn't to say that I haven't experienced those moments of fear to speak up in class when I realized I was one of the only students of color in a predominantly white class, or those moments of doubt when applying for things like leadership roles. And I think that taking those initial steps to jump over those hurdles was a different experience being a student of color in law school.
Yeah, I am very glad that you've had that experience, Karli. I have to say that I will have maybe a different experience at GW. I will caveat this by saying I am glad now that I am in law school, but I will also say anyone who knows me or who's close to me is flabbergasted that I am still here because it was terrible. Like the first semester was awful, like really, really bad. And I think the biggest critique that I have, particularly of the 1L experience, I will say, because I've been told that is different than 2L and 3L when you get to pick your own classes, but there is this idea that as a first-year law student, you must learn the basics. And the basics are that this is the law, it is this way because it is the law and it is what we follow. And here are the basic rules, and it is objective, and it is logical, and it is rational, and it is reasonable. And there might be some biases later when people apply the law, but that's what you learn later, but you have to learn the basics first. And for me, I'm sitting there going, but I know that the law was created by people who had their own biases, many of whom were white, slave-owning, racist, homophobic, transphobic, sexist, ableist, you name it, men. And they put their biases into this legal system that they constructed. We all know that. I mean, I think a lot of us do, most of us do, at least at some level. And to ignore that is to normalize that, is to say that that's okay, is to say that to accept it. And so it was really, really frustrating. I felt the whole school year, I felt that I was screaming into the void, to be honest. And at the end of the semester, I went to a talk that Professor Gambert was at, and I was like in heaven because seriously, she was one of the first people to say race at the law school. It was the first time I had heard like racism or systemic racism. I was like, oh my gosh, wait, we remember that exists here? Okay, this is cool. And I've been fortunate enough now to have an amazing criminal law professor as well this last semester who talked about that all the time and is wonderful. But it's been difficult, not to mention, of course, and this is the last point I'll make, is that, like I said, as much as Professor Gambert and my criminal law professor were amazing talking about race, they're both white women. I think that's probably the best I'm going to get, to be quite honest. There's only a handful of Black professors at my law school, and I'm not sure that I'm ever going to have them. And not to say Black women too. The only Black professors I can think of right now are Black men, but I have a limited range of knowledge. So it's been difficult.
Kailey, I would just love for you to, if you would like to, if you have anything more to say about your experience as a first-year student who got involved in the SALDF chapter at your law school, has that been like a similarly fraught and challenging space? Like it sounds like the rest of your sort of classroom experiences were, or yeah, do you have anything else to sort of share about that?
Yeah, and I'll be brief, but that's a great point. I didn't even touch on that. I get very passionate about about that other part. School's very important to me, and I want it to be good. And so I know that my SALDF experience was nothing like that. I had an amazing SALDF experience. Michael, who's on the call right now, I will try not to embarrass him, but I have been so thankful to know Michael. Michael was our SALDF president. Just graduated actually. And he was absolutely wonderful and super welcoming, and made the space be one that included racial justice and that thought about animal issues in a very intersectional way. And everybody that I met in the SALDF was super supportive, super on board. We even did a panel event on this topic with professors and activists. Dr. Reddy was on it, and Professor Gambert moderated. And so that was a wonderful experience. That was different. It was definitely I think it's an institutional problem more than it is a fellow classmates. Although I will say, when I brought it up to my fellow white classmates that I was having this experience in class, it was difficult to get support from them. But I think that also has a lot to do with the lack of bandwidth that we all have to think about these greater issues when we're going through the, intense rigmarole of 1L year.
AJ, I don't know if you can think back to your law school days to contribute anything to this topic.
Yeah, technically I just finished law school. I just graduated a couple weeks ago. But I think for me, I've never, or at least in law school, I never really had personal experiences because I was always the person who was doing social justice work for other people. So I was busy navigating the systems that were hurting, oppressing, and confining folks to being one kind of way. And I just, that almost afforded me a layer of protection, in that I had developed an identity as the social justice advocate at GW very, very early on. And so I wasn't necessarily presented with individual instances of people not respecting me, having microaggressions or things like that, because I represented something that was so much bigger than myself. And like that's a huge responsibility in law school, but also that's like a really deep honor and privilege, right? And I think Kailey made really good points. I was a later in life law student, so I had lived in the world, I guess, and I'd experienced the law in many different kinds of ways before getting to law school, and so I was under no preconceived notion about the specialty of the law. Like the laws at a very base level, just completely fake, arbitrary, and made up by those in power and who want to wield power over others. And I knew that from day one. And so I was under no preconceived notions about that. And I was very intentional and adamant about bringing up injustices of the law. Like, I don't know how many people are like super into legal cases, but there was a case a couple of weeks ago that upheld the insular cases, which is like some of the most racist group of cases in this country's history. And the Supreme Court in 2022 upheld those cases and said it was still good law. Like that's a wild amount of racism. And we kind of just like, yeah, okay, whatever, we move on. And so I think for me, I was really privileged in a lot of ways, but one of the privileges that I created for myself was this understanding that the law school needed me far more than I needed the law school. And at the end of the day, the work that I was doing was far more important than the grades that I got. I know for a lot of people coming into law school, it's really hard to see beyond your grades. But as a student, you can do so much more than getting an A or an A minus in a class. You can do so much more than being on a journal. And this is no shade to people. I always try to caveat this is no shade to folks who go through school doing that, more power to you, but like there's so much more you can do. And I think something that I wish more students knew was that law school is an opportunity for you to hone your skills as an advocate outside of the classroom. Like, who cares about the Socratic method and answering boring questions about some case that you probably briefed like 5 minutes before class started? Who cares about all that? You can use the skills that your school is teaching you to go at your administration and institutional power, right? You can use those to advocate within your broader community or city. Like they are giving you tools to fight the system. But I don't think students kind of pick up on that. And that's something that I wish like I could give more to students, right? Like challenge your professor. Like what's your professor going to do? Fail you out of the class? I mean, I guess maybe, but like, no, because law schools need to pass their students because they need their ranking. They need, the best of the best, and they need you to get good jobs, right? I think students have a lot of power within law schools that they don't know about. And they should use that to combat the system. And that includes, feelings of racism, feelings of being microaggressions when you're at a PWI. That includes maybe unfair grading practices, which I think like curves are completely arbitrary. Maybe that is professors who are not using appropriate and current language when referring to different identity groups, right? Like there are still tons of professors like at major institutions who use the R word when talking about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which is like wild, right? And so I know I'm just like kind of off, but I think students have the opportunity to fight their institutions in more than just like protesty ways or writing letters and getting signature kind of ways. Like you can do real tangible change within institutions. Like I created a whole new position at GW. It's the Dean of Diversity. I don't know what the new Dean position is, Professor Gambert, but the new Dean, like that took like 4 years of advocacy and didn't get created until after I left. And I had to have people, go behind me to do it. But like you can make institutional change. And I think that's one of the biggest opportunities in law school that I wish more students took advantage of, at least the ones who want to do social justice work.
Yeah, thanks to advocacy from you, AJ, we have a Dean, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Dean that was hired after you graduated. So thank you for your hard work on that. So I know that you, Karli, and you, AJ, both took at least one course in law school that touched on animal-related issues. AJ, you took my Gender, Race, Species seminar, and Karli, I'd love for you to share what course or courses you've taken. Kailey, I know that you just finished your first year, so you have not had an opportunity to pick your classes. And so I invite you to, respond to this if there's a way that it makes sense for you to do so. But for AJ and Karli, can you offer an example of how the issue of race arose in one of your animal-related courses in law school, and how you experienced that conversation, or maybe lack of conversation, and what you took away from that?
Yeah, this is AJ. I can go first. So race was baked into your class, Professor Gambert, and I think it was interesting. I wasn't the only student of color, but I was the only Black person, and then I wasn't the only male student, I don't think, but the male students were very, very small, maybe 2 or 3. And so oftentimes I found myself feeling like I was taking up space where other folks should talk, but then also I was the only one in the room who could provide the perspective of being a Black person in the world. And so that's really difficult to navigate, right? Like you don't want to be a dude in a predominantly non-masculine class, right? So there were trans folks, there were non-binary folks in the class, and there were cis women. Like you don't want to take up that space, but I thought it was really important, especially when we talked about the analogies of chattel slavery and people being treated like actual animals. and how that continues to persist in terms of how we view animals or subhuman animals or non-human animals, depending on your terminology. And so I was really happy that that came up in the class, and I think more classes should incorporate that. I hate the idea that the law is so isolated and siloed, right? Like you can do a critical race theory class, which I took at GW, and you can do an animal law class, right? But those two interact in so many different ways, right? Like there are multiple dimensions to the systems of oppression and shittiness that we experience, right? Or intersectionality, if that's the word that you like to use. And so I was really happy that Professor Gambert's class had those analogies and those kind of through lines, and we were able to talk about it. I think oftentimes when we create specialties in terms of areas of the law, we limit ourselves to what we can learn. And so I was just really grateful. Like I only found out about the class because I was cool with Hunter, who is an amazing advocate themselves. They're like they've taught me so much about trans allyship, non-binary allyship, gender non-conforming allyship. Like I owe a lot to my ability to advocate for those marginalized groups because of Hunter. And so I just felt really fortunate to take Professor Gambert's class because it opened my perspective of the work that I was already doing to show that I was still limited. In my perspective, there was so much more I could be and so much more I could advocate for. And so I felt really grateful about that class, even though it got cut off like halfway through because of COVID.
Yes, it did. But AJ, did you feel, I don't want to like put words or ideas in your mouth at all, but I'm just wondering, like, was it, to what extent, if at all, did it feel like a burden to you to, be the only, Black person in the class, and to recognize that if there was going to be somebody giving any kind of like firsthand experience kind of commentary in our class on a topic that related to Blackness, that was going to be like you sharing that?
I didn't really feel a lot. I felt kind of weird having to speak up for the historical struggles and current struggles of Black women, because I'm not a Black woman. And I'm not a Black trans person. So that was kind of weird, but no, I've been really fortunate most of my life. I've got to go to really privileged PWIs for a large chunk of my life. And so being the only Black person in the room is something that I'm unfortunately really comfortable with. So yeah, I think, and this is true now, and it was true, when I was growing up through these institutions, outside of these privileged gate-kept institutions, I have a wide variety of friends, right? I've got immigrant friends. I've got friends from Africa, Southeast Asia, West Asia, South Asia, just like all those different places, South America, Central America, like the Caribbean. I have tons of friends with tons of perspectives, and I've had a really rich upbringing outside of academia and the kind of institutions of power. And so I take that with me when I go into these places, right? I know that there are so many other varied stories and struggles. And again, I'm privileged to get into these spaces, whether that's right or wrong. And so, like I said before, I feel like I have a responsibility to give voice to those folks who aren't in the room. So yeah, I didn't, except for like being a Black man trying to talk about the experiences of Black women. Apart from that, no, I was really comfortable.
Thanks, AJ. Karli, I don't know if you have anything to share about this.
Yeah, so this year I was enrolled in a course called Environmental Justice. So I know that's not an animal law specific class, but we did touch just briefly on certain animal related issues, even though it was in the environmental law context. But that class was by far my favorite course, I would say, in law school, in the sense that the course looked at environmental issues through the lens of environmental justice communities. And those communities, EJ communities, are communities of color or low income communities who bear the burden of and suffer the most from the systemic issues of racism in the environmental law context. And so kind of touching up on what was said earlier, just in terms of how limiting the law is and how the law was not created for everyone. That was the moment where I was exposed to any of this and really realized all of that. And this course wasn't an easy one in the sense that the conversations and subject matter were just very sensitive and frustrating and quite traumatic. And so a few things that, I took away from these discussions were, one, to, of course, be a good and respectful listener, to check in with one another during and after the conversation. And that's something that our professor, I think, did a really great job with, was, making sure that everybody was at least doing somewhat okay after these very, very tough and challenging conversations. And she also did a really great job of laying out the guidelines and expectations prior to having these discussions. And I think that that's also really important to create that safe space for everyone to talk about these sensitive topics. And she shared resources and just kind of had these guidelines on respect and compassion prior to any sort of class discussion. And and I think just it was a great class. And I really feel that, like, even in the animal law context or just any sort of context, that you should have classes that talk about these things, because a lot of the times, as was mentioned earlier, it seems very compartmentalized, where it's like, this is animal law, this is environmental law, this is all of the discussions on race and social justice, but really they all are interconnected in so many ways that a lot of people might not realize. And so this class was really eye-opening for me. And sometimes it's as frustrating as it is to realize that, okay, you go through all of the different legal options in terms of how can these communities of color or low-income communities raise any sort of claim towards the injustice that is happening to them. And coming to the terms with that, there are so many options that actually you're not going to be successful with, and having to deal with that struggle of as an attorney or as a lawyer, you might have to have these conversations with these communities straight up and being like, I'm sorry, this is so unfair, but the law it has its limits, and there is really not much that we could do to help you in terms of the tools that the legal system gives us. And that's one of, I think, the most frustrating things that I discovered with this class was, our job is to help these communities and to help these people and, bring justice to all of the injustice that they've suffered. But with the tools that we're given within the legal system, sometimes we're just so limited. And so I think that goes to show too that there's just so much more room for improvement in these areas. But this course, was definitely the one that really just opened my eyes to all of these intersections and all of the problems and the things that we have still yet to accomplish and to tackle. But also there is hope. I don't want it to sound so dreary, but there is hope, and that's why all of us are here. So
Karli, a sort of similar follow-up question to what I asked AJ. I mean, did you feel any particular kind of additional burden or challenge being a student of color in that particular class to either raise or respond to topics or issues that related to race when they came up? Was that something that you felt like you navigated in a different way than maybe some of your white colleagues did?
I think it was interesting because I do feel like there were a lot of my classmates who are white who were the first ones to jump in on these conversations and to speak up first. And so in that sense, I think I was not the only person of color in that class. And so I think there were times where you could kind of sense that feeling of maybe this is not your time to speak up on this. I think that it did at times get a bit awkward, and where I felt, and I know my other classmates kind of felt like, we would maybe be better people to speak on certain issues, but we were not the first ones to raise our hand in that regard. So
Thanks. And Kailey, I don't know if you have, if you took a course at Pitzer, or if there's just anything you want to add to this question, with no pressure to do so, but I would like to invite you to, if there's anything you wanted to share.
No, I mean, I think they covered it well, so I'll let them speak on that.
Thanks so much. And, just given some of your comments that you've offered so far, all three of you, with regard to your experiences as advocates of color, both within and outside of the classroom, I'm wondering what advice you would give to other sort of students of color who are maybe interested in coming to law school specifically for animal law, or getting involved in animal advocacy and related sort of social justice movements.
Yeah, I'll answer this. I think that the most important thing for me has been to remember why. And I have kind of a different take on that than I think I've heard from some people. Not to remember why you're doing this. So I came to this for the animals, as I mentioned before, and it's important for me not just to remember, okay, I'm here for the animals, so whatever gets thrown my way, like, I'm here for the animals, I can take it. No, I'm here for the animals, so maybe it's not worth my time to engage in this conversation or engage in this this space that is not conducive to me and to my peace and to my learning and to my growth, because I'm not going to do that great work for animals that I want to do if I am broken down or discouraged or not protected and supported in the ways that I want to be. And so remembering that, I'm here for animals, this is the change that I want to make, and I can make that change. I can make that. I can have this movement can be all about racial justice and animal protection if I say it is, if that's what I want, if that's the change I'm going to make, then it doesn't matter if X organization leader doesn't see racial justice in their mission or doesn't see that as being part of what their audience is going to like. I'm bringing what I bring to the table. I'm passionate about this. I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to do what protects me and what helps me achieve that. And it feels kind of selfish, I have to say, right? Because the animal movement is all about, we do it for the animals. We do it for the animals. We do it. When I was little, I wrote on my mirror in my bedroom. My parents are out, they're going to be laughing because they know this. On my childhood bedroom, on my floor length mirror, I have written at the top, them before us. And because that's what, and I have a little board that's like, I'm not crying because I'm sad, I'm crying because they're suffering. Like I was, I bought into that, it is about the animals, it is about the voiceless, it is, and I'm mocking it, I still buy that. I do, that's still in my heart, but you have to be a little selfish too. Especially as a Black person, especially as a woman, especially as a person of color, you have to remember that you're here for this role to make this change, and you're not going to make it if you're not taking care of yourself and if you're not remembering that driving force.
Yeah, this is AJ. I love that answer. That's what I tell people all the time is, especially people who are kind of just going to go, or because their family wants them to, or because they've always dreamed of it. I was like, it's always good to have an actual reason why you want to be there, especially when you get overwhelmed or feel discomfort or something like that. But I think it's important to tell folks that law school is not as serious as everyone makes it out to be. I know I kind of talked about this earlier, but it's like, it's not that important. Like the editor of the law review, no one's going to care 2 years after y'all graduate who the editor of the law review was. No one's going to care how many moot court competitions you did, right? Like if you want to be a clerk, if you want to do all those steps, like sure, but like journal isn't mandatory, right? Moot court isn't mandatory. Mock trial isn't mandatory. One of the things that people tell you that you have to do in order to be successful or to have a successful experience are mandatory. Right? Those are all like extra things. You can pick up skills doing those things. You can make friends doing those things. You can even like network and make connections to get you a job doing those things, but they aren't mandatory. And I wish more not just more students, but more law schools and administrators realize that there are so many different types of law students. I went to law school to be a lobbyist. I had no intention of ever practicing law, of ever being in a courtroom. And I went to GW, which is 2 blocks from K Street, and there was one lobbying class and no one in the Career Center who could help me get a job on K Street, which is just an absolute failure of the institution. And I continue to say that every chance I get. And no one, like I had to figure out how to be a lobbyist on my own, whether that was creating student organizations, or that was being in student government and doing that fake politics stuff to kind of hone my skills and understand like how to do things. Like I had to create my own way, which was really frustrating, but I was allowed to do it, right? Like I didn't even try to get on a journal. Like I didn't even do the journal competition. I think I went to like Australia or something like that spring break. Like everyone's like, do it at the beginning of your spring break so you can go somewhere. I was like, I'm not going to do it at all. I left 3 days early and went to a completely different country, right? Like law school can be whatever you want it to be. And like there's this really, really well hidden secret is like, it's really hard to fail law school. Like, especially once you pass your first semester, like most law schools, it's really, really difficult to not graduate. And that gives you so much more freedom if you don't care about grades like me. Like you can quite literally do whatever with your time and still be able to get your degree. If you like summa cum laude, all those things, and like, yeah, go ahead. But like, if you don't care about those things and you feel like you're struggling and you're overwhelmed, just take a break. Like it's not as serious as people make it out to be. And that's the advice I would give.
I know, Karli, if you want to add.
Yeah, I guess what I think that everyone made some really good points. And so I just kind of wanted to share something that I had read last week that was really interesting to me, and I just thought it would be worth sharing. It reads, "We are a movement fighting against speciesism, but that doesn't mean we're morally superior or otherwise excused from challenging the persistent injustices that fellow humans face today. Our work as animal rights activists is only part of the whole, one of many movements fighting for social justice and equality for all. If we are to expect people to recognize the urgency of the animal rights issues that are important to us, then we should be willing to be sensitive to the problems of exclusion and marginalization faced by others." All of that is to say that, also social justice movements are interrelated. So just because we may focus on our efforts on one doesn't mean that we can turn a blind eye to others, and also that it's also empowering in a way that we all are interconnected and fighting for things that are important to us and that we're passionate about. And so we can just, sometimes it is tough, but we really do have each other and we can lean on one another to fight the good fight.
Karli, I love that answer, but it's just a teachable moment for me. We don't turn blind eyes. That's ableist, and most blind people don't intentionally not look at things. They're just incapable. And so that's just like a small change we can make in our language to be more inclusive. But I loved your answer.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
And I'll just sort of echo something that Karli said and Kailey said. One of the driving sort of motivators when I first came into this animal protection movement was a quote by George T. Engel, and he was asked, with so much suffering in the world, why focus on animals? And his response was, because I'm getting at the root of the problem. And I didn't think about it at the time, but that made me think like I can address all of these other issues that I and other humans are experiencing by just focusing on animals. And it took me several years to sort of unpack sort of the implications of that. And I think, again, we both spoke to that beautifully. Thank you.
I would like to ask a self-serving question, which is, what advice would you give to law professors like myself who are interested in designing animal law courses or courses that incorporate and center animals in some explicit way? So what advice do you give to law professors interested in designing those kind of courses to ensure that students of color are both meaningfully supported and not expected to bear a disproportionate burden of raising complex issues of race in the classroom discussions and in the course content? So do you have advice for folks like me that are trying to, create an optimal classroom experience for students of color in particular.
This is AJ. I don't really feel qualified to answer that because it's not my area of focus and expertise.
I think that one of the, I'll say this, my favorite professor that I've had so far in law school was my criminal law professor. And I loved her. I mentioned her before. She's also a white woman. And I loved her because of the way she was able to make me feel like I could voice my opinion, my experiences, my thoughts, but I didn't feel pressure to. And I knew that even if I didn't, those same issues, many of those experiences were going to be brought up in other ways. So by including, she had us, it was just an intro to criminal law class, but we would listen to podcasts every week of incarcerated folks, particularly BIPOC incarcerated folks, and got to hear about their experiences. We got to watch videos, we got to read articles outside of the textbook, outside of the case law. And yes, there was time to do all of this. There was time to talk about racial justice and still learn the basics. And then in the classroom, after we had read these, all of these materials, including the cases as well, the professor would ask everybody in the classroom, let's take a poll. Let's with, how we think these issues can disproportionately affect people, or what kind of impacts we think that these things like felony murder and mass incarceration, what kind of impacts these things have. Or let's look at this chart, let's look at this graph. And then have people say, what do you think about this? What kinds of things are coming to mind right now? How does this make you feel? To everyone. And the class was, largely white. And in that way, there were white students, many of the white students, able to engage and almost forced in a nice way. Like they had no choice but to engage in these topics, couldn't shy away from them. But I didn't have to bring them up, or the other 7 of us who were people of color didn't have to bring up these things. But if we wanted to, we could speak on them. Additionally, giving opportunities such as like reading responses, where we got to talk about some of these issues in private if we wanted to, ruminate on them, and other folks could as well. I think that is all to say that I think that giving multiple avenues of engaging in these topics and making these topics centered, like don't have a racial justice section, a racial justice week, a racial justice day. It has to be part of it all. Like it has to be woven into the mix, because unfortunately, as we all know or should know, it is all woven into them. Everything we do is based in white supremacy in this country. Everything is based on it. So we have to, constantly be acknowledging it. And I think the more ways that we can engage with the issue, the better the engagement is. And so I don't think that there's a magic trick of how to do it, but I think the more avenues that we get to engage with all of these things, the more we just make this a part of our everyday conversation, a part of the threads of animal law, animal welfare, rights, protection, whatever, the better off we'll be.
I totally agree with that. And I experienced, my professor in the environmental justice class using podcasts, bringing in guest speakers, and how enriching that was to the experience to be able to hear from the people themselves about their experiences. And so I think that is super, super helpful. And also something that I really appreciated from you, Professor Reddy, was over this past year was just the constant encouragement when it came to applying for awards or scholarships, or just participating in any sort of opportunity or event that, that may have come across your desk that I haven't seen and, you felt would have benefited me. And to me, that was so important, because I struggled a lot with taking that step of, okay, I've seen that there was this opportunity. I'm a little, afraid or having some doubts about actually applying or trying to participate in this event or opportunity. And so to have that encouragement, even if it was just a simple email from you saying, hey, I saw this, that this was happening, and I just thought that you would be interested, or I encourage you to apply for this. And to me, that was so helpful. And just that, even if it was just a little note or a sentence of encouragement, like it really helped push me to step out of the comfort zone and take those risks. And so I think even something as simple as that could make a world of a difference.
Karli, I just want to briefly ask a follow-up, and forgive me if I'm misremembering and you can just correct me, but I feel like in an earlier response, you said something about how maybe your environmental justice professor had some helpful language, maybe in her course syllabus or course policies, that spoke to the kind of, you know, classroom culture she was trying to create. So just correct me if that's wrong and I'm misremembering, but like, to what extent, if at all, did that have meaning for you? Is that something you would recommend faculty do?
I think that was really helpful, especially since I felt pretty new to having these open discussions on topics of race, and in the classroom setting at least. And so on like her Moodle page, she would have a bunch of, I believe it was actually on the Lewis and Clark website, but there's a whole, you know, document on you know, terms that are more appropriate to use in the setting, or just her specific guidelines on this is what I expect from every single one of you in this classroom the moment that we start to have these, you know, tough and sensitive discussions. And so I think that was really good to just really create that safe space, or at least set the expectation of, you know, this is what is, you know, that may come up in these conversations, and how she expected us to, you know, kind of go about and navigate the whole, just the discussion or just the day. And so I think that was really helpful, especially for people who might not have experience talking about just, yeah, or having these discussions about topics of race.
Thanks.
Thank you. We have a couple questions that have come through the chat, this one at least by direct message, but so this is for all of you. How do you see yourselves being able to honor your cultures, ethnicities, identities, and the practice of animal law and advocacy in the future?
I can speak to this really briefly. So I'm actually at work right now, but my position this summer is I'm working at a litigation office called the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation. So I'm from Hawaii. And so this office is a nonprofit that works specifically to advocate for Native Hawaiian rights and to maintain and also uphold our tradition and our culture and our language that is currently on the decline. And so this has been a really, even though I'm not focusing specifically on animal law with this role, I feel like it's such a great, you know, it's a great experience to be able to really be in touch with, you know, my home and where I've come from. And also, although I am not of Native Hawaiian descent, to be able to help those and the community that, you know, I grew up in. And even, you know, just this past weekend, we've done a lot of community service work where we're being in touch with the culture that, you know, is unfortunately not as obviously as strong as it was before, and even the language. And so it's really nice to kind of just come back and actually be in touch and do work with the communities, the indigenous Native Hawaiian communities here. So I'm hoping to do more of this type of work in the future, and somehow maybe find a way to link that with animal law. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of room for that to happen, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Karli. We got a really thoughtful both question and comment from Professor Winders, and I'd love to just hone in on the question, but you can all read the rest of her comments there. So she asks whether you can please share your thoughts and recommendations for professors teaching first-year courses so first year courses, trying to incorporate recognition of topics like white supremacy, speciesism, and more, while also making sure core principles and adequate bar prep is conveyed. So we had some, I think Kailey, you kind of addressed some of this, how your criminal law professor did it. I don't know if you have any sort of additional tips and strategies to add. And of course, AJ and Karli would love to hear any thoughts you have to share.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could all be accomplished kind of by what I was saying earlier about with my criminal law professor, where we never, you know, we never had specific, like, well, and this is the day where we talk about how criminal law is racist. It was more like, you know, we'd have a day, we were going through all the different types of murder, and we have a day on felony murder. And the class starts out with, you know, we listen to a podcast about, in addition to reading the cases on felony murder, we listened to a podcast about somebody who was, you know, convicted of felony murder, which, for those of you who don't know, is basically you can go to prison for murder when you didn't actually kill anybody, just because you were involved in a crime that was occurring when the murder happened. And this disproportionately affects Black and brown folks. And so we would listen to a podcast about somebody who was, you know, sent to prison when they were 15 because they robbed someone with their friends, and then someone ended up dying. And we would listen to how that affects their lives. And then the professor would speak throughout the class as we're talking about the rule. And so, and here the felony murder rule is this, and the prosecutor has discretion here. And, you know, as we know, prosecutors are often white and often in positions of power. And this is how this is showing kind of how white supremacy, how racism is really embedded in all of these systems. And it was just, you know, a sentence or two at each topic, but it adds up, you know, as we start to see the patterns, we start to get a sense of the bigger picture of all of this. And I think it, not to minimize, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it doesn't have to be a big, like, and now we go to the racism section. Like, it's just, you know, kind of talking throughout about, and in addition, these things have these, you know, consequences for race and for other marginalized groups as well. But again, I think it's the just repeated recognition, demonstrating these patterns, demonstrating how it's kind of just a thread throughout, as opposed to, and here is the day, and it's in this little box. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think there's so many ways to sort of center non-human animals in every course, right? There's, you know, property is coming to mind because non-human animals are legally considered property in our legal system, criminal law. There's so many ways, you know, of course, animal cruelty is coming to mind, but even, you know, if you're doing a module on domestic violence, there's all of this, you know, social science research that shows, I'm sure everyone on this call probably knows this, but maybe a lot of first year students don't, that there's, you know, connection between non-human animal violence and intimate partner violence in a home. So there's just a lot of ways, I think, sort of to Kailey's point, where non-human animals can be brought in and centered into conversations without it being like the animal module. So I just think it's something that takes like an explicit choice on the professor's part. I want to also just highlight, I'm really inspired by everything in this comment, but I just want to say that thanks to, so in the comment we have in the chat, at Vermont Law School this semester alone, thanks to pressure from students, we've added a required first semester embedded racism in the law course and created a multicultural center and a dean of DIEJ position. I mean, all of that in one semester is kind of mind-blowing and a huge credit to student activism and advocacy. So I'm really inspired by that. Thanks for sharing that.
Yes, absolutely. I have a question here. In an animal law class, is there a way to consider slavery as a precedent for change from legal property to legal personhood in a way that doesn't create a hostile environment or disadvantage some students in the room. For instance, have you seen a course contextualize our legal system's systemic racism in a way that encouraged inclusive and open discussion and learning? So I think two parts to that question.
I think, sorry if you can hear my dog. I think my partner's about to come in. But I think something that we have to work on as advocates and folks who care is getting more people who care up to speed, right? Social justice is often self-selecting, but we self-select our particular thing. And that's what we do instead of realizing that a lot of these things have overlap and we need folks who do specialize in certain things, right? But I think going back to the previous question and trying to answer this question, it's like, at least in the US, there isn't any law that hasn't been touched by white supremacist heteronormative patriarchy, right? Whether it's the folks who are writing and drafting the law hundreds of years ago, whether it's to correct those things, whether it is, with intention to harm certain marginalized groups. I think as a baseline, it should be taught that we cannot escape these systems. Oftentimes we try to change these systems, and I think we do so at an inadequate level, but at least we're trying. But I think when you talk about how do you incorporate that, it's a lot easier to incorporate the idea of chattel slavery and property becoming persons or getting full autonomy if students have a baseline understanding that it's all connected, right? Like you still see, and this is AFCO's, but one of AFCO's books, right? Like you still see how zoological racism is what AFCO calls it, but like how the distinction between human and non-human animal is very fungible depending on how racist your society is, and how they treat the most marginalized. So I don't think it would be an issue or be fraught with the potential to harm students or make them uncomfortable if we were actually teaching how all of this is interconnected and really just all the same system of oppression, right? I think oftentimes we aren't willing to be radical enough for all types of reasons. Like academia is extremely conservative, if not reactionary sometimes, against, common accusations of it being like indoctrination. But like the actual institutions of academia, if not like the students and professors are oftentimes very conservative and afraid of change. And I think we have to do a better job of fighting those systems, like in like gatekeeping mechanisms. I think the previous question talked about the bar, right, which is an absolute gatekeeping mechanism that keeps a lot of marginalized folks out of the profession under the guise of, standards of practice or care or whatever, let alone like ignoring, how many people become disbarred after they've already passed character and fitness for however many years, right? It's a total sham. But I think like, honestly, and this is just me speaking personally now, but like if you're really about your social justice movement or movements, however you want to define them, whatever you're in, like I think within academia where we're privileged, and we have to be a little bit more radical in what we're doing and what we're teaching and what we're offering.
Thank you, Kailey or Karli, if you want to speak to that.
I don't know, Kailey, if you have anything to add, but AJ, I think you did a great job. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a good answer.
Well, thank you. One more question. I mean, Karli and Kailey, I mean, you're both currently undertaking internships and have, some aspirations to establish careers in the field of animal law. And AJ, you've spoken about, doing work in the social justice arena more broadly. And so for all of you, given your experiences and what you've spoken to today, what do you think is important, integral, vital for animal advocacy and other social justice organizations to be thinking about or doing better to support prospective, BIPOC candidates or volunteers?
So as I mentioned before, I'm kind of at a crossroads right now. Sort of. My heart's going to be always with the animals, but I'm at a crossroads right now, trying to figure out where to go next. And I think what I want animal organizations, the animal movement, to know or to do is, you can't do this. You can't do this the way that it's continuing to be done. Like, it can't keep on this way. We can't do things the way that we've always done them. We can't. The animal movement has had a lot of reckonings recently with, the mid 2000s sexism and sexual assault and harassment culture has really come to light in the animal movement, and how misogynistic it is. Well, it's time now for us to have the racial justice come to Jesus moment, because we're not going to do it. We're not going to keep doing things the way we have. And I think that I as I mentioned before, I had my own experience in summer of 2020 with, sorry, that's my dog, she's ready for dinner. I had my own experience in summer of 2020 with organizations I was close with, literally telling me, no, we don't have a place for racial justice. Like, we can't do this right now. And I'm somebody who cares about animals more than anything in the world. Like, it is my heart. It is what I want to do with all of my soul. And I don't know if I can. And I think that I wish that animal leaders would sit with that for a minute. Like, I am here willing to give up everything to devote my life to animals. And I don't think I can do it, because you wouldn't put out a statement on Black Lives Matter, or you wouldn't engage in racial justice or consider white supremacy in your organizations. And I think it's just time that I think it's time that organizations really sit with the fact that we have to address this, and we have to address this now, because you're gonna lose this is where we're headed. This is what the future is, and you're gonna lose a lot of us who really, really want to be here and really, really want to be doing this, and who arguably have a lot to give to the movement. So that's what I wanted to know.
Kailey, please, Raj, go ahead.
It's going good.
Kailey, I just wanted to ask you, it sounds, this crossroads that you're at, I think is a completely relatable and understandable place. And I'm also thinking, like, I wonder if there's a space, not trying to tell you what to do with your life and your career at all, but I'm just wondering if there's a space with enough people that are interested in sort of showing up in solidarity with each other in this moment to say, like, to have this reckoning, and so that people that are in exactly your crossroads feel supported to say, actually, this is what I've been like writing on my mirror since I was a little kid. I'm going to push forward, but not at the expense of my, self-worth or of my mental health or of my energy, but because I'm going to say, I'm going to kind of draw a line in the sand, and I'm going to say, I want to create something different in solidarity with others that want to do the same thing. And, I guess that's a lot of like burden to put on those maybe right now relatively few people that see that vision, but I'm hoping that maybe there is this like small, committed group of people that wants to kind of create that change, so that 10 years down the line, you might be, you know what I mean? Like, there's another 1L that might not be at that same crossroads because the movement's in a different place. I don't know. Do you feel like, I don't know what the question is, like optimistic, or do you feel any sense of hope that there could be a groundswell towards that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now I feel like the options are, do I go to a POC-led animal organization? Do I go to a mainstream white-led animal organization and try to infiltrate and make change? Infiltrate in a very nice way, obviously, right? Make it include racial justice. Or do I just say, screw it, I'm going to become a public defender, because I am ready. I'm ready to do that too. But I kind of feel like those are the only options right now. But
There's another option. You could create your own organization.
This is true. This is true. Well, and listen, if anyone here is excited about this or about that, point me in that direction. I'm there. I'm just I don't know. I hope so, but to be honest, I have to say, like, it has been very discouraging because I have approached people whom I have very close relationships with and repeatedly just been told that there's not a space for this in the animal world because it's pandering or out of line or that I need to do it, or you do it and report back. I've also gotten that, like you do some research and then let me know, and then nothing will happen. And, so I hope, and if anyone listens to this and is excited or knows other people who are excited, I'm ready to change the movement. I'm ready to take it on. So
I don't know if there's anything in closing that our panelists want to share with us. Any closing thoughts, any advice, any insights that you've had either from this conversation or just from your work in the animal and other social justice movements that you want to leave us with? No pressure to respond, but just an opportunity to sort of leave us with any thoughts before we wrap up tonight.
Yeah, this is AJ. I had a question, and I also wanted to respond kind of to Kailey. My question is how do you get people to care about animal rights and animal liberations, especially social justice folks who are allegedly pushing for a better world, but are just not picking up on this, right? They haven't been touched by the education. They don't have access to the education or the literature, right? Like they genuinely want to do good, and allegedly do good well, but they're just completely not pushed in this direction. Like, how do you, like, as a teacher, as a professor, someone who teaches animal law, how do you say, like, hey, you love your social justice classes, but you need to have animal liberation as one of the pillars of your education? How do you do that? And then to Kailey's point, like, I don't do direct animal rights liberation work. I talk about it in some of my other work indirectly, but also, again, it's all interconnected, right? Like, whatever you choose to do, like, if you're trying to dismantle the capitalist system, like that will inherently help animals who will no longer have to be mass produced and factory farmed, right? At least, like, that would be the hope. I don't know how you could sustain that without capitalism, but right, like, there are other ways to go about at least trying to do the work, but maybe it's not direct. And like, I hope you find your way. Creating an organization isn't fun, but it's rewarding. The organization I created was in the middle of the pandemic, and I had to do a lot of free labor to do it, but it's impacted like thousands of people allegedly. So it's possible.
Raj, I don't know if you wanted to speak to AJ's first point / question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And it's one of the, I serve on a couple of DEI committees here at Lewis and Clark. And one of the things that I'm always hesitant to do is when we're talking about racial justice or, rights for women, to bring in some of the animal ethics, because it can kind of feel like, and maybe sometimes it is, co-opting, some of these issues, but what about the animals? What about the animals? I want to acknowledge that there are spaces where we talk about, what happens to Black students and what happens to, South Asian students and what happens to women on campus. And I agree with everything that AJ said, that it is all interconnected and we all have to be thinking about these things more critically. But it's difficult. It's difficult when we haven't had sort of this foundational sort of conversation like we're having right now to really appreciate that I'm coming to this as a supporter. And I want to address too, just how these things are interrelated so that when we're working in this space, we're also working in this space and this space and this space. And to the extent that we can have conversations like these, and that to the extent that, Karli, AJ, and Kailey are going to be sort of the leaders in this field for, years to come and other fields for years to come. I'm really heartened that these conversations are going to take place and are going to be constructive.
I love giving students opportunities to think about, just explore the connections. You know, a lot of my students tell me, I teach the seminar that I've called Gender, Race, and Species, and they've told, you know, I don't know, 85% of my students say, I signed up for the gender, race part, and the species part is like, what? Like, okay, I guess, you know, that's the add-on part that I don't know anything about, and I don't know that I'm interested in. But over the course of the semester, students really do, I think more deeply about the fact that they are a human and what that means. A lot of my students come in saying, you know, I ask them to write a journal. I'm like, what's the first time you remember that, or that you realized you were coded as fill in the blank, coded as, for in my case, like a white person, or coded as a woman, or coded as a human being. And a lot of people, you know, say some version of like, I don't know that I've ever thought that about like being coded as a human being. It's so invisible, right? And, you know, if you think about these issues over the course of 15 weeks, is that going to change the whole trajectory of your life? Maybe in a lot of cases, no, but, you know, I'd like to think that in some cases it plants seeds to help people, you know, sort of take these thoughts and experiences and readings and discussions with them into ways that are really hard to predict and maybe a lot of times intangible. But I mean, AJ, I'm absolutely positive that you're not thinking about the intersections between non-human animals and the other social justice work that you do only because you took my course, but I'm hoping that my course might have added additional, you know, support to your already strong foundation in thinking about those issues, right? And so one course or one professor can't, you know, can't like necessarily revolutionize somebody's mind, but maybe we can provide tools and support that like plant seeds for these, you know, thought processes to happen, you know, years into the future. I don't know. That's my hope anyway.
Yeah, you definitely impacted me. And I think to the other point about talking about, you know, women's spaces or misogynistic environments for students, right? Like the objectivity of women and non-mass people is like rooted in a kind of speciesism, right? Or dehumaning, right? Just objectifying them and taking away their humanity. I think oftentimes we forget that the removal of humanity is one part of speciesism or, you know, animal oppression, but two, like intrinsic to almost every other system of oppression, right? When you are removing someone's humanity, it's saying that they are less than human and you know, a subhuman animal, right? It's all interconnected. And, you know, to your point, I don't think that I can see how that oftentimes seems like it's taking up space, especially when it comes from white men who are usually the animal advocates in the room. But if the message is presented correctly, it's like, hey, these are all connected. And like, we have to understand that it's not taking away from one movement to include another, because it's all the same, right? Towards liberation.
That seems like an amazing place to end. Karli and Kailey, did you have any last words before we wrap up?
For me, it's just thank you all to everyone who's here. And for those of you who are in the animal movement, I personally really appreciate you being here and taking time to engage with us in this conversation. And I hope you're taking these back to your organizations and your fellow advocates. And yeah, like I said, if anybody is engaged in this work and wants to keep doing it in the animal world, I'm ready to be part of it.
If you feel willing, no pressure to do so, but you could put your email into the chat in case people might want to reach out to you, Kailey. And Karli, did you have anything that you wanted to say in closing?
Just wanted to reiterate thanks to everyone, and especially to all of the panelists today. I've learned so much from all of you, and it was so nice to meet you virtually. And I'm hoping that, yeah, we can all just kind of keep in touch, and I'd love to see where all of you end up and all the great work that you will end up doing as well. So
I wanted to say a huge thank you to Karli, Kailey, and AJ for being our panelists today and being so thoughtful and sharing their insights and being vulnerable with us. I learned a lot. I want to thank Raj and Kailey for really being the architects of this event. And thank you to all of you that attended today. And this has been a really rich and inspiring program for me. And thank you all for being part of it. So thank you so much.
Thank y'all so much.